You gonna pick that up, or should I call housekeeping? The quarter spun across the tile floor beneath the diner lights, wobbling in uneven circles before finally tipping onto its side near Elijah Carter's boot. For a second, nobody moved. Forks paused halfway to mouths. A waitress standing near the coffee station froze with a glass pot still in her hand. Even the old country song humming through the ceiling speakers suddenly felt too loud for the room. Derek Whitmore leaned one elbow against the register counter with the smug patience of a man enjoying his own performance. His white dress shirt stretched tight beneath his black manager's apron, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms like he was too important to be standing there, but wanted everyone to know he was in charge anyway. Thought you people liked spare change, he added casually, loud enough for the nearest booths to hear. A few uncomfortable chuckles slipped through the dining room. Elijah lowered his eyes toward the scattered coins near his boots. 3 quarters, 2 dimes, a nickel. The kind of change most people forgot in cup holders or dropped between couch cushions without caring enough to reach for it. Outside the restaurant windows, rain tapped softly against the glass beneath the glow of a flickering red neon sign that read Miller's Grill. Interstate trucks rolled past slowly on the wet highway beyond the parking lot, their headlights stretching across the asphalt like pale ribbons. Elijah stood still near the register, broad shoulders relaxed beneath a faded brown work jacket darkened by rainwater. His jeans carried dust stains around the knees, and the leather of his boots had softened from years of wear. To most people in the diner, he looked like another tired black man passing through town looking for cheap coffee and somewhere warm to sit for an hour before driving again. Nobody noticed the quiet sharpness in his eyes. Nobody noticed the way he had already studied the entire restaurant within minutes of walking in. The cracked vinyl booths. The exhausted teenage busboy moving too fast because he was scared of being yelled at. The older waitress rubbing her wrist every time Derek turned away. The little handwritten sign near the kitchen that read "Now Hiring" in desperate red marker. Elijah slowly bent down and picked up one of the quarters between 2 fingers. The cold metal reflected the overhead fluorescent light for half a second before disappearing into his palm. "Sir," Lena Brooks whispered from behind the counter, her voice barely audible, "I can fix this." She looked embarrassed just standing there. Mid-20s, hair pulled into a tight bun. Tired eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from smiling through 10-hour shifts for customers who barely saw you as human. Derek shot her a sharp glance. "Stay out of it, Lena." Elijah straightened calmly, dropping the coins into his jacket pocket one by one. No anger crossed his face. No raised voice. Just silence. And somehow that silence unsettled the room more than shouting ever could. Derek scoffed and slid the receipt across the counter with 2 fingers. "Next time," he said, "try not ordering food you can barely afford." The words hung in the air like grease smoke. Elijah looked at him for a long moment. Then his eyes drifted slowly past Derek toward the dining room behind him, toward the overworked staff, toward the nervous customers pretending not to watch, toward the little boy sitting in a booth beside the window, quietly staring at the coins that had hit the floor. The child's mother lowered her gaze immediately when Elijah noticed them. Rainwater dripped from Elijah's jacket cuff onto the tile. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone dropped a tray and cursed under their breath. Still Elijah remained calm. Then finally, in a voice so steady it almost sounded gentle, he asked, "How long have you been managing this place?" Derek Whitmore let out a short laugh and folded his arms across his chest as though the question itself amused him. "Long enough to know exactly who belongs in my restaurant and who does not," he replied. The fluorescent lights above the register buzzed softly, casting pale reflections across the chrome napkin dispensers and coffee-stained counters. Elijah studied the man quietly for another second before giving a slow nod. "I see." His voice carried no anger, and somehow that bothered Derek more than if the customer had snapped back. Men like Derek understood complaints. They understood shouting, threats, scenes. Calm unsettled them because calm meant control. Elijah reached for the warm ceramic mug sitting near the edge of the counter and took one final sip of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. Bitter. Burnt. Cheap beans brewed too long beneath a heating plate that should have been replaced years ago. He noticed details automatically. The cracked sugar container near booth 7. The outdated safety inspection sticker hanging crooked near the kitchen door. The way every employee stiffened slightly whenever Derek walked past. "You done here?" Derek asked. Elijah placed exact bills beside the register. "No tip." Derek smirked at that. "Thought so." But Lena noticed something different. As Elijah turned toward the exit, his eyes moved slowly across the restaurant one final time, not like a customer leaving after breakfast, but like someone memorizing the place, measuring it. The little boy near the window still watched him silently while clutching a grilled cheese sandwich in both hands. Elijah paused beside the booth just long enough to straighten a dropped crayon from the floor and place it gently beside the child's plate. "You dropped this, buddy." The boy blinked up at him. "Thank you." His mother offered a quiet smile filled with embarrassment and gratitude at the same time. Elijah tipped his head politely and continued toward the door. Rain drifted sideways through the parking lot beneath the buzzing neon sign outside. The cold evening air smelled like wet pavement, gasoline, and fried onions leaking from the diner vents overhead. Elijah pulled his jacket collar slightly higher as he stepped beneath the awning. Across the highway, headlights moved through the darkness in endless streams, disappearing into the rain one after another. Behind him, the restaurant door swung open sharply. "Sir." Lena hurried outside, apron strings fluttering in the wind. She stopped a few feet away, slightly out of breath. "I just wanted to say I am sorry about that." Elijah glanced back toward the glowing diner windows. Derek was already yelling at someone near the kitchen pass-through. Even through the glass, his frustration carried visibly through every sharp gesture and impatient movement. Elijah slid his hands into his jacket pockets. "You do not need to apologize for another person's behavior." Lena gave a tired little shrug. "Maybe not. But sometimes when you work somewhere long enough, you start feeling responsible for what happens there anyway." For the first time that evening, something softened in Elijah's expression. "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 3 years." "And him?" She exhaled slowly through her nose before answering. "About 8 months. Ever since corporate started talking about budget cuts, he has been trying to impress people." A truck thundered past on the interstate, spraying mist across the road shoulder. Lena lowered her voice slightly. He was not always this bad. But once he realized nobody above him was paying attention, something changed. Elijah looked back through the rain-speckled window again. Derek stood near the register laughing loudly with 2 customers now, acting as though nothing had happened. Inside the kitchen, one exhausted cook wiped sweat from his forehead while trying to keep up with incoming orders alone. "People show their true character when they think nobody important is watching," Elijah said quietly. Lena frowned slightly, studying him more carefully now. There was something unusual about the way he spoke. Too measured. Too observant. Not like a tired traveler passing through town. "You are not from around here, are you?" she asked. Elijah smiled faintly. "Not anymore." Before she could ask another question, headlights swept across the parking lot as a black SUV slowly turned beneath the diner sign and rolled toward the far end of the building. Clean. Expensive. Completely out of place beside rusted pickup trucks and 18-wheelers. Lena noticed it immediately. So did Derek through the front window. His entire posture changed at once. Shoulders back. Chin lifted. Smile suddenly polished. "Probably another district supervisor," Lena muttered nervously. But Elijah simply watched the SUV idle silently beneath the rain. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in slow, steady rhythm, while the engine continued humming low beneath the storm. Then Elijah reached into his pocket, pulled out the diner receipt Derek had tossed toward him earlier, folded it once between his fingers, and slipped it carefully into his wallet. The black SUV remained parked beneath the rain for nearly 2 full minutes before the driver's side door finally opened. A tall man in a charcoal overcoat stepped out holding a leather folder beneath one arm, while another woman remained inside the vehicle speaking into a phone. Through the diner window, Derek Whitmore instantly straightened his tie and brushed invisible crumbs from the front of his apron. "Everybody move," he snapped toward the kitchen line. "Tabletops wiped now. Coffee filled. Smiles on your faces." The staff moved faster immediately, not because they respected him, but because they feared the sharp humiliation that came whenever he felt embarrassed in front of corporate visitors. Lena hurried toward booth for carrying fresh silverware, while one of the teenage servers nearly slipped, trying to refill water glasses too quickly. Derek marched toward the entrance with a polished grin already forming before the man from the SUV even stepped through the door. Warm air rushed inside as the stranger entered the diner, bringing with him the scent of rain and expensive cologne. "Good evening," Derek said smoothly. "Welcome to Miller's Grill." Derek Whitmore, general manager. The man nodded once without smiling. Mid-50s. Clean gray hair. Calm eyes that missed very little. "Richard Lawson," he replied while removing his wet coat slowly. "Regional operations." Derek's smile widened instantly. "Of course. We were told somebody from the company might stop by this week." Richard glanced around the restaurant in silence for several seconds. The buzzing lights. The sticky menus. The nervous employees avoiding eye contact. His gaze finally paused near the front windows where Elijah still stood beneath the awning outside, watching the highway through the rain. "Busy night?" Richard asked. Derek chuckled lightly. "For this location, yes. We get all kinds passing through off the interstate." The wording barely registered to anyone else, but Lena noticed the slight emphasis Derek placed on all kinds. She also noticed Richard noticing it. Derek continued talking too quickly now, eager to impress. "I inherited a mess when I got here. Poor staffing. Low standards. Customers treating the place like a truck stop. But I have cleaned things up." Behind him, one exhausted dishwasher struggled to carry a plastic tub overflowing with plates. A server accidentally dropped a fork. Derek shot her a cold glare sharp enough to make her hands shake harder. Richard accepted a cup of coffee, but did not drink it. "How is employee turnover?" he asked calmly. Derek waved one hand dismissively. "You know how people are these days. Nobody wants to work. Especially not around here." Again, Lena noticed it. The coded tone. The kind that always floated just beneath Derek's smile. Richard looked toward the kitchen where a cook wiped sweat from his forehead while trying to manage 6 orders alone. "Seems like they are working pretty hard to me." Derek forced a laugh. "Well, some of them." Near the window, the little boy from earlier pointed quietly toward Elijah, still standing outside. "Mom," he whispered, "that man is still here." His mother gently lowered his hand. Elijah remained beneath the awning with one shoulder against the brick wall, watching rainwater slide along the parking lot in silver streaks beneath the neon lights. Calm. Patient. Like he had nowhere else he needed to be. Richard noticed him too. "Friend of yours?" he asked Derek casually. Derek barely glanced outside before scoffing under his breath. "Just some guy causing attitude problems earlier." Lena stopped moving for half a second after hearing that. Elijah had not raised his voice once. Not once. But Derek needed him to sound difficult, because cruel people always rewrote stories in ways that protected themselves. Richard studied Elijah through the rain-speckled glass for another long moment. "Did he complain?" "Not exactly," Derek replied carefully. "You know how some people are? They come in looking for trouble." The words settled heavily into the diner air. Even the cook near the grill looked down quietly after hearing them. Richard finally took one small sip of coffee before setting the mug back onto the counter untouched afterward. "Interesting," he murmured softly. Outside, Elijah slowly checked the silver watch beneath his jacket cuff. Then his eyes lifted toward the SUV parked beneath the sign. The woman inside had finally ended her call. She stepped out carrying a slim black umbrella and a stack of documents pressed tightly against her chest. When Derek saw her walking toward the entrance beside Richard's vehicle, his confident smile flickered slightly. Because unlike Richard, this woman did not look like regional management. She looked like legal. The woman stepped through the diner doors with rain sliding from the edges of her black umbrella in thin silver streams. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone used to entering rooms where people immediately stood straighter without knowing why. Dark navy coat, leather gloves, a slim folder tucked neatly beneath one arm. Derek's polished smile returned instantly, but this time it carried uncertainty around the edges. "Good evening," he said quickly. "Welcome to Miller's Grill." The woman gave a polite nod while closing her umbrella carefully beside the entrance. "Monica Bennett," she replied. "Corporate legal." The air inside the diner shifted almost immediately. Lena saw it happen in Derek's face first. That tiny flicker people showed when confidence suddenly collided with fear. Derek cleared his throat softly. "Of course. We were not expecting legal tonight." Monica removed one glove finger by finger before answering. "Neither were several employees at your Tulsa location last month." Derek's smile tightened. Richard Lawson quietly watched everything from the counter without interrupting. Monica's sharp eyes moved slowly through the restaurant. The trembling teenage server carrying overloaded plates. The exhausted cook visible through the kitchen window. The faded cleanliness rating near the register. Then finally her attention landed outside on Elijah beneath the awning. Unlike Derek, she did not look surprised to see him there. "Has Mr. Carter already eaten?" she asked calmly. Derek blinked once. "Excuse me." Monica glanced toward him without changing expression. "Mr. Elijah Carter." Silence spread through the diner so fast, it almost felt physical. Lena stopped beside booth 6 holding a tray against her chest. Even the cook behind the grill looked up. Derek's eyes drifted automatically toward the man outside, standing quietly beneath the neon light. Rain shimmered around Elijah's silhouette, while interstate headlights moved behind him like distant ghosts. "You know him?" Derek asked carefully. Monica looked mildly confused by the question. "Of course I know him." Richard lowered his coffee mug onto the counter with deliberate slowness. Derek laughed nervously now, trying to recover control of the moment. "Well, if he is a corporate guest, nobody informed us." Outside, Elijah finally pushed himself away from the brick wall and stepped back toward the entrance. His boots crossed the wet pavement steadily while raindrops slid from the shoulders of his old brown jacket. Monica opened the diner door for him before he even reached it. That tiny gesture alone made Lena's stomach tighten. People like Monica Bennett did not hold doors for random customers. Warm air rolled across Elijah as he stepped inside again. The restaurant fell nearly silent except for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the soft hiss of the grill from the kitchen. Derek forced another smile. "Sir, if there has been some misunderstanding earlier tonight, I am sure we can clear it up." Elijah looked at him calmly. "A misunderstanding?" Derek swallowed lightly. "I did not realize you were with corporate." Elijah removed his damp jacket slowly and folded it over one arm. Underneath, his dark button-down shirt was simple but sharply pressed despite the long drive and rain. "That seems to be the problem tonight," he replied quietly. "Everybody keeps deciding what matters based on what they think they see." Monica stepped beside him and handed over the leather folder she had carried inside. Elijah accepted it without opening it immediately. Derek noticed the way Richard Lawson straightened slightly the moment Elijah touched the folder. Respect. Real respect. The kind Derek had been trying unsuccessfully to imitate all evening. "Mr. Carter," Richard said carefully, "we can proceed whenever you are ready." The words landed harder than shouting. Lena felt her pulse quicken. Around the diner, employees exchanged confused glances while customers pretended not to stare openly. Derek's face had lost nearly all color now. "Proceed with what exactly?" he asked. Elijah finally opened the folder. Inside rested several contracts clipped neatly together beside updated ownership documents carrying the Miller Hospitality Group logo across the top. The silver lettering reflected beneath the harsh diner lights. Elijah glanced down at the papers only briefly before closing the folder again. "Tonight was supposed to be a quiet visit," he said. "Just one meal before tomorrow morning's transition meeting." Derek stared at him without speaking. Elijah's eyes moved slowly across the restaurant again. The frightened employees. The exhausted kitchen staff. The little boy still clutching his crayon beside the window booth. Then his gaze settled calmly back on Derek. "But sometimes," Elijah continued softly, "you learn more about a place in 5 minutes as an ordinary customer than you ever could sitting in a boardroom." No one in the diner seemed to breathe after Elijah finished speaking. Rain tapped steadily against the windows while the red neon sign outside buzzed softly above the parking lot. Derek Whitmore stood frozen beside the register, one hand still resting near the untouched coffee mug Richard Lawson had abandoned minutes earlier. The confident posture he had worn all night had started collapsing piece by piece. First the smile disappeared, then the sharpness in his voice. Now even his shoulders looked smaller somehow beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. "Transition meeting?" Derek repeated weakly. Monica Bennett opened another folder and slid several documents across the counter toward him. "Ownership transfer finalized at 4:30 this afternoon," she said calmly. "Effective immediately." Derek stared down at the papers without touching them. The silver Miller Hospitality logo reflected against the polished counter, while legal signatures stretched across the bottom of every page. Elijah Carter, chairman and majority owner. Derek blinked hard once as though the words might rearrange themselves if he looked again. They did not. Around the diner, employees exchanged stunned glances. One of the cooks slowly stepped closer to the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands nervously on a towel while pretending not to listen. Lena remained beside booth 6, clutching her tray tightly enough for her knuckles to pale. The little boy near the window looked back and forth between Elijah and his mother with open confusion. "I do not understand," Derek muttered. "You came and dressed like—" His words stopped before finishing. Elijah raised one eyebrow slightly. "Like what?" Silence. Heavy and immediate. Derek swallowed hard. "I just mean—" Nobody said. Elijah stepped closer to the counter, not aggressively, simply steadily. "Nobody said the new owner might look like a man who works with his hands." Derek said nothing. "Nobody said he might drive his own truck across 3 states instead of flying private." Still silence. Elijah's voice remained calm, almost gentle, which somehow made every word land harder. "Or maybe nobody said he might be a black man wearing work boots instead of an expensive suit." Derek lowered his eyes immediately. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, while somewhere in the kitchen a timer beeped twice before stopping again. Richard Lawson folded his hands quietly in front of him. Even Monica remained silent now, allowing the weight of the moment to settle naturally through the room. Elijah reached into his jacket pocket and removed the crumpled diner receipt he had saved earlier. He unfolded it carefully against the counter. A faint grease stain marked one corner beside the total amount. "Do you know why I kept this?" Elijah asked. Derek shook his head slowly. "Because this receipt tells me more about your management than any quarterly report." He tapped the paper lightly with one finger. "Cold coffee, served anyway. Staff terrified to speak. Customers treated differently, depending on appearance. Fear mistaken for leadership." Derek's face flushed darker with every sentence. "Mr. Carter, if I offended you earlier, I apologize." Elijah looked at him quietly for a long moment. "You did not offend me, Derek." That seemed to surprise him. "You revealed yourself." The words settled across the diner like falling ash. Lena looked down at the floor for a second because suddenly she understood something painful. Elijah had known exactly who Derek was long before the ownership reveal. He had known the moment those coins hit the tile. Derek rubbed one trembling hand across his jaw. "I was under pressure. Corporate has been demanding results." "Pressure does not create character," Elijah replied softly. "It exposes it." Rainwater slid down the windows behind him in silver trails beneath the interstate lights. "Do you know what I saw when I walked in tonight?" Elijah continued. "I saw employees working scared instead of proud. I saw a manager more focused on appearances than people. I saw a waitress apologize for cruelty she did not commit because she has worked too long in an environment where kindness feels dangerous." Lena's eyes widened slightly after hearing that. Derek glanced toward her instinctively before quickly looking away again. Elijah rested one hand lightly on the counter. "This restaurant does not have a staffing problem," he said. "It has a dignity problem." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The little boy by the window quietly picked up the blue crayon Elijah had returned earlier and began tracing circles against his paper placemat again. Soft, absent-minded, innocent. Elijah finally looked toward Monica Bennett. "Schedule a full review of this location tomorrow morning." Monica nodded immediately, already prepared. Derek's throat tightened visibly. "Mr. Carter, please. I can fix this." Elijah studied him carefully beneath the humming lights. "That depends," he said quietly, "on whether you only regret being wrong, or whether you regret becoming the kind of man who thought another human being deserved humiliation over a handful of coins." The diner grew strangely quiet after Elijah's words, not the tense silence from earlier when people were waiting for an argument, but something heavier now, something reflective, the kind of silence that made people look inward whether they wanted to or not. Rain continued sliding down the tall front windows in soft, crooked streams, while headlights from passing trucks swept through the restaurant every few seconds, washing pale white light across tired faces and empty coffee cups. Derek Whitmore stood motionless behind the register, staring at the wrinkled receipt still resting beneath Elijah's hand. His mouth opened once as though he wanted to defend himself again, but no words came out this time. For the first time all evening, he looked less like a manager and more like a man realizing he had slowly become someone he did not recognize anymore. Lena quietly set her tray down near the counter. The metal edge made a soft clink against the laminate surface that seemed louder than it should have in the stillness. "Sir," she said carefully toward Elijah, "would you like fresh coffee?" Elijah looked at her for a moment before nodding once. "Thank you." She moved toward the coffee station while the little boy by the window continued coloring slow, uneven circles on his paper placemat. His mother brushed a hand gently through his hair without taking her eyes off Elijah. Near the kitchen doorway, the exhausted cook finally leaned against the wall for the first time all shift, rubbing tired fingers over the back of his neck while grease crackled softly behind him on the grill. The entire restaurant felt different now, like something invisible had cracked open. Lena returned with a fresh mug and carefully poured steaming coffee in front of Elijah. Warm curls of steam rose beneath the fluorescent lights, carrying the rich smell of dark roast through the diner. Elijah wrapped both hands around the ceramic cup for a second without drinking. "What is your name again?" he asked softly. "Lena Brooks." "How long has it been since somebody here asked if you were doing okay?" The question caught her off guard completely. She blinked once, almost embarrassed by how quickly emotion crossed her face afterward. "I do not know," she admitted quietly. Derek lowered his eyes toward the floor. Elijah nodded slowly like her answer confirmed something he already suspected. "Restaurants are hard places," he said calmly. "Long hours, fast pressure, people carrying stress they bring in from outside. But none of that excuses forgetting that employees are human beings before they are labor." The rain outside softened gradually into a light mist now, leaving silver beads clinging to the diner windows beneath the red neon glow. Richard Lawson finally spoke again after remaining silent for several minutes. "Mr. Carter has visited 11 locations personally over the past 6 weeks, he said. Not one employee knew who he was beforehand. Several workers looked surprised hearing that. Richard continued quietly. Some locations passed. Some did not. Derek swallowed hard again. Elijah finally lifted the coffee mug and took one slow sip. This time he did not grimace afterward. Lena noticed immediately. Fresh coffee, properly brewed. Small details mattered. Elijah looked toward the teenage busboy still nervously wiping tables near the back corner. "What is your name?" "Miguel, sir." "How old are you, Miguel?" 17. Elijah nodded. "You are working hard tonight." The teenager looked genuinely confused by the compliment. "Thank you, sir." Derek watched the interaction silently, with something close to shame settling deeper across his face every minute. Because kindness inside that diner had become so rare, employees no longer knew how to react when they received it. Elijah slowly reached into his pocket again and removed the handful of coins Derek had thrown earlier. Without speaking, he placed them carefully beside the coffee cup one at a time. Quarter, dime, nickel. The tiny metallic sounds echoed softly across the counter. "My father used to save spare change in an old glass jar beside our kitchen sink," Elijah said quietly while studying the coins. Said every coin mattered because every hour somebody spent earning it mattered too. The diner remained silent around him. "We were poor for a long time," he continued. "There were nights my mother skipped meals pretending she was not hungry so my brother and I could eat first." Derek looked up slowly after hearing that. Elijah's eyes never left the coins. "So when somebody throws money at another human being like it is garbage, what they are really throwing away is dignity." A truck horn echoed faintly from the interstate outside. The little boy near the window finally slid off his booth seat and walked quietly toward the counter, holding his blue crayon drawing in both hands. He stopped beside Elijah and shyly pushed the paper forward. "I made this for you." Elijah looked down. The child had drawn a simple picture of a man standing beneath a red sign in the rain. Small silver circles covered the ground near his feet. "Coins." Elijah smiled softly for the first time that night. "Real this time. Gentle. Human." "Thank you, buddy," he said. And somehow, in that quiet little moment beside the humming diner lights and cooling coffee, the entire room felt warmer than it had all evening. The clock above the pie display read 9:17 p.m. when the last family finally paid their check and stepped out into the misty Oklahoma night. The diner doors closed softly behind them, leaving only the employees, the hum of old refrigeration units, and the fading smell of coffee lingering beneath the fluorescent lights. Outside, the interstate still moved endlessly beyond the rain-dark parking lot, but inside Miller's Grill, time suddenly felt slower. Smaller. More honest. Elijah remained seated at the counter with the child's crayon drawing resting beside his coffee cup, while Monica Bennett reviewed paperwork near the far booth and Richard Lawson quietly typed notes into a tablet. Nobody rushed. Nobody raised their voice. The sharp tension from earlier had burned itself out, leaving only the uncomfortable weight of truth behind. Derek Whitmore stood near the register with both hands braced against the counter as though he needed something solid to keep himself upright. His tie had loosened slightly. The polished manager image he worked so hard to maintain all evening looked worn thin now beneath the buzzing overhead lights. Lena slowly wiped down the last empty booth near the windows, though there was almost nothing left to clean. Mostly she needed something to do with her hands. Elijah finally stood from the counter and walked slowly toward the center of the diner floor. His boots echoed softly against the tile. Every employee instinctively looked up when he moved. "Can everybody come here for a minute?" he asked calmly. No one hesitated. Miguel stepped away from the bus tubs. The cook removed his apron and joined the group near the register. Even the dishwasher peeked out nervously from the kitchen doorway, with soap suds still clinging to his forearms. They formed a loose half-circle beneath the faded menu boards while Elijah stood quietly in front of them. Rain ticked gently against the windows behind his shoulders. "I know tonight was unexpected," Elijah began. "And I know some of you are probably worried about what happens next." Nobody spoke. Elijah looked carefully at each face one by one. Tired faces. Cautious faces. People who had learned over time not to trust promises too quickly. "I grew up in restaurants like this," he continued softly. "Not fancy places. Places off highways where hardworking people stopped because they needed warmth, food, and somebody to treat them decent for half an hour before getting back on the road." The cook lowered his eyes quietly. Elijah continued. "My mother worked double shifts in a diner outside Little Rock for 14 years. She used to come home smelling like grease and coffee every night." A faint smile touched his face briefly. Said she could still hear ticket printers in her sleep. A few employees smiled faintly at that because they understood exactly what he meant. "What I learned watching her was simple," Elijah said. "People remember kindness longer than they remember prices." Derek finally looked up after hearing that. Elijah's eyes met his briefly before moving back to the staff. "This company does not need perfect employees," Elijah continued. "It needs human beings who care whether the people around them leave feeling smaller or stronger." Lena felt her throat tighten slightly after hearing those words. Because for the first time in years, somebody with real power inside that building sounded less interested in numbers than in people. Elijah took another slow glance around the diner. "Tomorrow morning, this location begins restructuring. Immediately. Staffing reviews. Equipment updates. Fair scheduling practices." Miguel blinked in surprise. The exhausted cook folded his arms slowly across his chest, as though trying not to look hopeful too quickly. Then Elijah's gaze settled carefully back onto Derek Whitmore. The silence shifted again instantly. Derek straightened uneasily. Elijah did not raise his voice. "Derek," the manager swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." Elijah walked closer until only the counter separated them again. "Do you know what the hardest part about leadership is?" Derek shook his head slightly. Elijah rested one hand against the worn laminate surface where the coins had scattered earlier that evening. "It is not making decisions," he said quietly. "It is remembering that every person standing in front of you has already fought battles you know nothing about." Derek's jaw tightened. Elijah continued calmly. "A tired waitress. A teenage busboy helping pay rent. A truck driver carrying loneliness across 3 states. A black man in work boots who reminds you of assumptions you never questioned." The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. "You looked at me tonight and decided my dignity had less value than yours." Derek lowered his eyes again. "And the worst part is," Elijah said gently, "you probably did not even realize you were doing it." Nobody moved. The cook stared at the floor. Lena clasped both hands tightly together near her apron. Even Monica Bennett stopped turning pages in her folder. Derek's voice finally came out rough and quiet. "I was wrong." Elijah studied him silently for several long seconds. Then he nodded once. Not triumphantly, not coldly, just thoughtfully. "That is the first honest thing you have said all night." The rain finally stopped just after 10:05, leaving the diner windows streaked with silver water lines beneath the fading neon glow outside. Inside Miller's Grill, the air carried the warm smell of fresh coffee, dish soap, and cooling fry oil, while employees moved more slowly now that the rush had ended. Nobody seemed eager to leave. Not yet. Something important had happened inside those walls tonight, and everyone could feel it even if they did not fully know how to describe it. Elijah stood near the counter beside the old pie display, while Monica Bennett quietly organized paperwork into neat folders. Richard Lawson had stepped outside to take a phone call beneath the awning, leaving only the soft hum of the restaurant and the occasional clatter of dishes from the kitchen sink. Derek Whitmore remained near the register, silent and unusually still. Gone was the polished manager performance from earlier. Without the sharp tone, the forced confidence, and the constant need to dominate the room, he suddenly looked older. Tired in a way expensive shirts could not hide. Elijah picked up the little boy's crayon drawing again and studied it for a moment before carefully folding the paper in half. "You know," he said quietly without looking up, "my mother used to keep every drawing my brother and I ever made." Nobody interrupted him. Did not matter if it was messy. Did not matter if the colors made no sense. A faint smile touched his face again. She said when people feel safe somewhere, they leave pieces of themselves behind. Lena leaned lightly against the coffee station listening. The exhausted cook stood near the kitchen doorway with folded arms, while Miguel slowly stacked clean glasses nearby. The entire diner felt softer now somehow, less like a workplace and more like a room full of human beings finally lowering their guard. Elijah carefully slipped the drawing into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he turned toward Derek. "Walk with me." Derek blinked once in surprise, but nodded immediately. The two men moved slowly toward the far end of the diner, near the windows overlooking the interstate. Headlights drifted through the darkness outside in long white streaks, while distant thunder rolled softly somewhere beyond the hills. Elijah stopped beside the booth where the little boy had sat earlier. The blue crayon still rested forgotten near the napkin dispenser. Derek remained standing awkwardly beside him. "I grew up angry for a long time," Elijah said quietly. "Angry at people who looked at my skin first and my humanity second." Derek stared at the empty booth without speaking. "When I was 16, a store owner followed me through his grocery aisles for 40 minutes because he assumed I would steal something." Elijah's voice remained calm, but every word landed with weight. "When I was 23, a man handed me car keys at a hotel because he thought I was valet parking." Derek closed his eyes briefly. Elijah continued, "And when my company started becoming successful, I learned something else." He glanced toward Derek. "Money changes how some people hear your voice, but it does not always change how they see you." The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Outside, a semi-truck rolled past beneath the wet interstate lights. Derek finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "I do not have an excuse for tonight." Elijah nodded once. "No, you do not." Silence settled between them again. Then Derek surprised himself by saying something he had probably avoided admitting for years. "I think somewhere along the way I started treating people badly because it made me feel important." Elijah looked at him carefully. There was no anger left in Derek's face now. Only exhaustion and shame. Honest shame this time. Small power can become dangerous when a person feels small inside. Elijah replied quietly. Derek gave one slow nod as though the sentence hit somewhere painfully accurate. "Am I fired?" he finally asked. Elijah looked back out the window for several seconds before answering. "You were expecting punishment tonight." Derek swallowed. "Yes. That is because punishment is easy," Elijah said softly. "Anybody can throw someone away after they fail." He turned back toward Derek fully now. "The harder question is whether failure teaches anything." Derek looked stunned hearing that. Elijah folded his arms loosely across his chest. "You are stepping down as manager effective immediately." Derek lowered his eyes. "But you are not leaving this restaurant." His head lifted again in confusion. "Sir, for the next 90 days, you will work every position inside this diner except management." Derek stared at him speechless. "Kitchen prep, bus tables, dish pit, morning coffee station. You are going to learn what this place feels like from the side of the people you stopped seeing." The interstate lights reflected softly across the window glass beside them. Elijah's voice remained calm. "And if after 90 days these employees believe you have changed, then we will discuss what comes next." Derek's eyes glistened faintly beneath the diner lights before he looked away quickly. Elijah extended one hand toward him. "Because dignity," he said quietly, means believing people can become better than their worst moment. After a long hesitation, Derek slowly shook his hand. 3 months later, the first thing people noticed about Miller's Grill was the laughter. Not loud laughter. Not the forced kind customers used when trying to be polite. Real laughter. The kind that drifted naturally from the kitchen during slow hours and carried softly beneath the hum of coffee machines and clinking silverware. The old neon sign outside still buzzed faintly over the interstate, and the building itself still looked weathered beneath Oklahoma skies. But something inside the diner had changed completely. Morning sunlight now poured through the front windows in warm gold rectangles across the tile floor, while fresh coffee filled the air before dawn truckers even reached the counter stools. Miguel no longer rushed nervously between tables. The exhausted cook, whose name Elijah had learned was Thomas Reed, actually smiled now when customers complimented the food. And Lena Brooks stood confidently behind the front register wearing a Navy supervisor shirt with her name embroidered neatly above the pocket. She still moved quickly during rushes, still balanced 3 coffee mugs at once with practiced ease, but the heaviness in her eyes had faded. Customers noticed that too. Elijah sat quietly in the same booth near the window where the little boy had once colored circles onto a paper placemat months earlier. A fresh cup of coffee rested near his elbow beside a stack of regional reports Monica Bennett had dropped off earlier that morning. Outside, dawn mist rolled low across the highway while 18-wheelers moved steadily through pale, orange sunlight. The diner doors opened every few minutes now, with travelers carrying cold air and tired faces. Inside, and almost every customer received the same greeting the moment they entered. Morning. Sit wherever you like. Warm. Human. Simple. Elijah watched Lena refill an older truck driver's coffee before quietly slipping an extra biscuit onto his plate after overhearing him mention missing breakfast during his overnight route. Small kindnesses. The kind his mother used to believe mattered most. Near the kitchen pass-through, Derek Whitmore carried a tub of clean dishes toward the back sink, wearing a plain gray work shirt without the manager apron he once treated like a crown. He looked different now. Not defeated. Quieter. More aware. The sharp arrogance had slowly worn away during those 90 days of working every position inside the diner. He learned how heavy bus tubs felt after 10 straight hours. Learned how hard cooks worked when orders stacked endlessly during rushes. Learned how invisible dishwashers became even while keeping the entire restaurant running. Most importantly, he learned people talked differently around someone who finally listened instead of controlled. Derek paused near booth 7 when an elderly woman accidentally dropped her fork beneath the table. 3 months ago, he probably would have called for a server to handle it. Today he bent down himself, picked up the fork, and returned moments later with a clean replacement wrapped neatly in a napkin. Here you go, ma'am. The woman smiled warmly. Thank you, sweetheart. Derek nodded once and continued toward the kitchen without noticing Elijah quietly watching from across the room. Monica Bennett slid into the booth opposite Elijah and placed another folder beside his reports. Employee retention is up 40% already, she said softly. Elijah glanced around the diner again before answering. People stay where they feel respected. Monica followed his gaze toward Derek. You made the right call keeping him. Elijah remained silent for a moment. Derek laughed quietly at something Miguel said near the coffee station while helping carry fresh produce boxes toward the kitchen. Not performative laughter this time. Just human. Elijah finally spoke. Some people never change. But some people simply spend too long believing cruelty is strength because nobody ever taught them otherwise. Monica nodded thoughtfully. Sunlight reflected softly against the diner windows now, replacing the cold rain and neon shadows from that first night months earlier. Elijah reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and unfolded the old crayon drawing the little boy had given him. The paper edges had softened from being carried so long, but the picture remained the same. A man standing beneath a red sign in the rain with silver coins scattered near his boots. Monica smiled faintly after seeing it. You kept it. Elijah looked toward the front counter, where Lena laughed gently with 2 customers over something written on the breakfast specials board. Some things are worth remembering, he said quietly. Near the register, a small glass jar now sat beside the cash drawer with handwritten letters across the front in black marker. Community Coffee Fund. Customers dropped spare change into it every day to help pay for meals when travelers came through short on money. Quarters, dimes, nickels, tiny sounds of metal softly clinking against glass. Elijah stared at the jar for a long moment while morning sunlight warmed the diner around him. Then he lifted his coffee cup slowly and listened as the restaurant carried on beside the interstate exactly the way his mother once described long ago. Not perfect, not fancy, just people trying to make each other feel a little less alone before continuing down the road.